morning everyone, it's Lisa here with you today on the Crafty Meraki YouTube channel. I thought that today I would create one of those cards that we never like to make, a sympathy card. With the events here in the UK over the past week with the death of the Queen, it got me thinking about sympathy cards, how I don't have any in my stash, and I thought the Happy Hello set would work really well for a sympathy card. And I've challenged myself to use just 2 markers, and I'll explain more about that in a little while. So we're going to start by stamping our image. As I'm doing some watercolouring today, I'm going to stamp using VersaFine Clair Nocturne. I sometimes use VersaFine Onyx Black, but really it's just whatever I have to hand. So just inking up the stamp there, and I'm going to stamp that down onto some Bristol Strathmore Smooth cardstock, which works really well for Karin markers. As I mentioned, I'm going to attempt to colour today with just 2 markers, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But for the flowers themselves, I'm using Red 209. If I use watercolour markers, I mostly use Karin or Zig Clean Colour Real Brush markers. And the reds are never a true red. They're always like a pinky red or a violety red or something like that, that you never really get a true red. And that's okay. That doesn't matter for today's card. But what I really want to try and do is make sure that the colour is kind of quite light and airy on each of the flowers. So I'm just adding in a tiny bit of the marker around the centre of each flower and a little bit up each of one of the sides of each individual petal, and I'm blending that out, and you can see that I sort of blend 4 or 5 times. I tap off to the side, and that just enables me to clean off the brush nib and then bring it back into the centre again or onto the petal and blend out that colour even further. So it is almost white around the outsides. And I continue to do this over all of the petals, and I have sped up the colouring now so you don't have to see it all in real time. The process is pretty much the same on every single petal, a tiny bit of pigment and then blending it out almost to white or at least a very light pink. And I put some onto the acrylic block there. Sometimes if I want to add a little bit in and the paper is still quite wet, I tap in to the ink on the acrylic block, and it just sort of helps control a little bit more how much you put down. So if I was to put the pen down again on top of an already wet area, I would probably oversaturate it, but adding a bit onto an acrylic block just helps you pick up tiny amounts and add that into your colouring. Now this is not strictly a watercolour paper, so I don't use loads of water. It can take a fair amount, but I do make sure not to oversaturate it. And I'm now going to go onto the leaves, and this is warm grey and it's 03, and the process is exactly the same. So why did I choose 2 markers? Well, when I think of sympathy cards, and there's no right or way wrong to think about them, but I always think of them as something quite clean and simple with very little fuss, often with flowers. And so I thought that having just 2 colours and no layers and keeping the colouring fairly light and airy, that would work really well for a sympathy card. And I chose grey for my leaves just because I felt that that was a little bit more muted, a little bit more in keeping, I suppose, in my mind with how I wanted the sympathy card to look. If I'd have done my leaves in green, for instance, it would have almost felt like a kind of normal summery or spring card. So to change it up and give it a different feel, I changed the colour of the leaves to grey. When I was thinking about the colours of the flowers themselves, I actually wanted a dusty blue, but I didn't have a suitable marker, which is why I went for a kind of red pink and kept it as light as I could. And here I'm just adding in the grey I'm not even really blending out these tiny thin little sections here. I'm just adding the marker in direct and not even adding any sort of clear water to blend that out, and that actually helps to really darken those so they do appear like a different colour, but it is actually the same marker. And I'm just finishing off here now, just adding in the colour to the stems and any other bits that I've missed. In the spirit of trying to keep this card as unfussy as possible, but wanting to add a little bit more interest, I thought I would add some splatters. So I've smushed some abandoned coral and black soot distress ink onto the media mat at the side there, and I'm using a number 2 round brush for my splatters, and that's going to make sure that they stay really tiny. And you'll see that in a moment when I hold the panel up nearer to the camera, that it adds a really nice detail, but it is very kind of unfussy and quite subtle. So you can see there how pretty they are in the 2 different colours that match the rest of the colour I've used on the main image. Now I'm just going to trim the panel down with a rectangle die. So I made sure that it was completely dry before I taped my die down and ran it through the die cutting machine. And actually this is my second panel that I've filmed. On my first panel there was a tiny bit left that was still wet, and it smudged as I went through the die cutting machine. So this time I made sure it was completely dry before I trimmed it down, and I'm just adding some foam tape onto the back, and I've popped that onto a top folding A2 grey note card. The sentiment that I'm going to use is with Sympathy, and that actually comes from the Happy Hello set as well. So I've stamped that with Versamark ink onto some black cardstock. I used a white detail embossing powder and heat set, and I've just added a little bit of foam tape onto the back of that, and I'm now just going to pop that up onto my panel. To finish the card off, I used a few Ivory Opal gems. I thought that they would work quite well. Again, a little detail without being over fussy. And that brings us to the end of today's card. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on Sympathy cards. Are they something you create when you need them? Do you have a few on hand in your stash? Is there anything that you particularly veer towards when you're creating them? I'd love to know. Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching today. I'll be back next week with another video for you, but I hope that you've enjoyed seeing this. Give it a thumbs up if you have. Share it if you'd like others to see it, and maybe consider subscribing if you haven't already. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend.